Okay, welcome. We are now doing SAT practice test number 3, module 1. So before we get started, let's kind of review what we've learned so far. We're going to focus less on the details. We're going to map the relationship between the ideas. We're going to find the hints, this, colons, these two are very important, and we're also going to be paying attention to tricky wording. So vocab is essentially going to be this and this always. Anytime that you guys feel that you are uncertain about a vocabulary word, make sure you look it up and find the correct connotation. Okay. Number 1. In the early 1800s, the Cherokee scholar Sequoyah created the first script or writing system for an indigenous language in the United States. Because it represented the sounds of spoken Cherokee so accurately, his script was easy to learn and thus quickly achieved blank use. And then here we have our little colon. By 1830, over 90% of the Cherokee people could read and write it. So our word here, after achieved, easy to learn and thus quickly achieved blank, needs to be kind of showing this example here. Remember, the use of a colon is I see colon example. Right? So if it says over 90% of the Cherokee people could read and write it, between widespread, carefully, unintended, and infrequent, widespread is going to be our best answer. It was easy to learn and thus quickly achieved widespread use. Why? Because over 90% of the Cherokee, or how, I guess, how would be over 90% of the Cherokee people could read and write it. Okay, next one, number 2. When Mexican-American archaeologist Zelia Maria blank blank published her 1886 research paper on sculptures found at the ancient indigenous city of T in present-day Mexico, other researchers readily blank her work as groundbreaking. This recognition, here's our word this, recognition, meaning that whatever comes before here is going to now be a positive term because she received recognition, stemmed from her convincing demonstration that the sculptures were much older than had previously been thought. Okay, so looking at the answer choices, we see acknowledged, denied, ensured, and underestimated. So we need to show that her work was groundbreaking and this recognition. So our word needs to be close to recognition, which is going to be acknowledged, right? Readily acknowledged her work, saying that it was groundbreaking. And that was equivalent to recognition. Okay, number 3. Like other tribal nations, the Muskogee Creek Nation is self-governing. Its national council generates laws regulating aspects of community life such as land use and healthcare, while the principal chief and cabinet officials blank those laws by devising policies and administering services in accordance with them. So the National Council generates laws while the principal chief and cabinet officials blank those laws. What did they do? They devised policies and administered services in accordance with them. So implement, presume, improvise versus mimic. It's going to be while the chief and cabinet officials implemented those laws. That will be our answer. Someone generates it, the others are going to implement those laws that were generated. Okay, number 4. In the indigenous intercropping system known as the Three Sisters, maize, squash, and beans form a blank web of relations. Maize provides, okay, we have another colon here, provides the structure on which the bean vines grow, the squash vines cover the soil, discouraging competition from weeds, and the beans blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this example of maize providing the structure, the squash vines cover the soil, which discourages competition from weeds, and the beans aid their two sisters by enriching the soil with essential nitrogen. So they're working together, web of relations. So between indecipherable, ornamental, obscure, and intricate, intricate is going to be the best answer for sure, because we need to show a web of relations. If it is a web, it is not indecisive or ornamental or obscure. Intricate is the word that will explain web, and that's why D was our answer. Okay. Number 5. The artisans of the IE Guild in Benin City, Nigeria, typically blank the bronze and brass casting techniques that have been passed down through their families since the 13th century. But they don't strictly observe every tradition. For example, Guild members now use air conditioning motors instead of handheld bellows to help heat their forges. Okay, so they don't always strictly observe every tradition. Typically, they do this, the techniques that have been passed down, which means that whatever this was here, bronze and brass casting techniques were quite traditional, but they don't strictly observe every tradition, why they did something like this. So that means that this one here should be along the lines of follow, right? They generally follow the traditions that are passed down, but they don't strictly observe every tradition, like that. So experiment with means to change it. Adhere to is going to be our answer. Improve on is an assumption. So a lot of students would have tried to choose between B and C because improve on is not technically incorrect, but it does make an assumption about the passage that we cannot assume, right? That we cannot decide for ourselves without evidence. So it's definitely going to be adhere to is the best answer. Oh, there, okay? Adhere to. They typically adhere to the techniques that have been passed down, but they don't always follow every tradition. Number 6, okay. Some economic historians blank that late 19th and early 20th century households in the United States experienced an economy of scale when it came to food purchases. They assume that large households spent less on food per person than did small households. Economist Trevin Logan showed, however, that a close look at the available data disproves this supposition. There we go. Okay. So the definition for the harder ones I wrote down for you, questioned or regretted, I'm hoping and assuming that you guys already know. Surmised, form an assumption with little evidence, contrived, created through trickery. Okay, so already looking at this, we know that it's not going to be trickery. That wasn't mentioned. Some economic historians blank, blah, 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 they assumed. So here the dash functions really similarly to a colon. Here it's IC dash example. So if the example states that they assumed previously, that means that our answer should also be assumed. A, some economic historians surmised that late 19th and early 20th century households in the United States experienced an economy of scale when it came to food purchases. They assumed blank, like that. Okay, and then also they say supposition down here as well. Okay. Moving on to the next question, number 7. The work of Kiowa painter T.C. Cannon derives its power in part from the tension among his blank influences. Another colon. So, like I said, this and colon, and I guess dashes as well, are very, very common for vocab questions. Exclamation points. Okay. Now, how was there a tension among his blank influences? Classic European portraiture with its realistic treatment of faces, the American pop art movement with its vivid colors, and flat style, the intertribal painting style that blah, 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 typically achieved through shading and perspective. So there's a lot. So we're going to be kind of looking at what this is saying. There's classic European portraiture, semicolon, the American pop art movement, semicolon, right? And flat style. So he has 3 parts, and there's going to be a tension among his blank. So because these things are so different, whether it be classic, pop, or flat style, which is intertribal, they're very clearly different. Our answer is going to be distinct, disparate. So among his disparate influences, blah, 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 there was a tension. It wouldn't make sense to say complementary, right, because that implies harmony. Okay. Erasing, and we'll move on to number 8. Okay. New and interesting research conducted by blank is inspired by their observation that though there have been many studies of the effect of high altitude on blood chemistry, there is a blank studies of the effect on blood chemistry of living in locations below sea level, such as the California towns of Salton City and Sealy. Okay, wow, I could not understand that. We're going to read it one more time. There have been many studies of the effect of high altitude on blood chemistry. There is, okay, so contrast word, though, so there has not been is what we're looking for then. There has not been a lot of studies of the effect on blood chemistry of living in locations below sea level. There we go, okay? So though, we need to contrast that word though. Our options are quarrel about, paucity of, profusion of, and verisimilitude. So lack of, paucity is going to be your answer, which has to be the opposite of there have been many studies. There have been many studies for that, but not for the effect on blood chemistry of living in locations below sea level. Like that. Okay. Reading. Okay, so now we're going on to our critical reading questions. I added one little note because we've been using this skill so often, and as we go along the tests and you guys get more comfortable with thinking about the test in a more simple way, I'm going to add things that are important for you to also consider. So, reading. As you read, consider the importance of the ideas. Again, this is as you read so that we can save time. This is a timed test. As I read, I'm going to highlight, underline anything that I find important, but I'm going to ignore and tell myself that it's okay to ignore those things that were not important. We're going to find keywords in the answer choices. We're going to delete the obviously wrong answer choices. Oh, let's include that, right? So what this means is we have A, B, C, and D. As we go through the answer choices from A, B, and C, D, if there's ever something that I don't feel completely confident with, I'm going to write a maybe next to it. Sometimes there's going to be only one maybe in a question. Sometimes there's going to be two. The ones that I'm very confident about, there's a word there, there's a keyword within the answer choice that I know I can delete right away, then I'm going to delete those. And then now there's no need to go back and check it unless I feel certain, again, that A and C, there's not an answer in between. So there are times where we'll make mistakes taking the test. So we said A and C are going to be maybes, but then there's no answer between them. Only then should you reconsider B and D, just in case you made an assumption that was incorrect earlier. Yeah, this is like a checking method to make sure that we catch ourselves when we make mistakes. So delete obviously wrong answer choices first. Mark anything that you're unclear about or could possibly be an answer as maybe, and then you'll choose between those maybes. Number 9. The following text is from Sarah Orne Jewett's 1899 short story Martha's Lady. Martha is employed by Miss Pine as a maid. Miss Pine sat by the window watching in her best dress, looking stately and calm. She seldom went out now. And it was almost time for the carriage. Okay, so it looks like there's going to be some carriage arriving. Martha was just coming in from the garden with the strawberries and with more flowers in her apron. It was a bright, cool evening in June. The golden robins sang in the elms, and the sun was going down behind the apple trees at the foot of the garden. The beautiful old house stood wide open to the long-expected guest. Okay, a mention of another guest. We know that Miss Pine is looking out the window. Martha was just coming in from the garden. So it's like a description of setting and they're both waiting for something to happen. Keep that in mind. Let's go look at the question. Okay, which choice best states the main purpose of the text? A, to convey the worries. To focus on depict, contrast, describe, and convey are going to be taking a lot longer and feel less certain than to find other keywords. Worries is very different from any of the other words within B, C, and D. So that's how I kind of determine whether something is considered a key word or not. Definitely key. To convey the worries brought about by a new guest, I guess you can also incorporate new guest, but you know, there's also visitor here in D, so it's easier to check for worries than it is to check for new guest and visitor, right? They essentially mean the same thing. B, we're going to check for how the characters have changed over time. Did they change over time? If not, we can delete it. So definitely not this one. Definitely not A, right? Because there were no mentions of worries. C, to contrast the activity indoors with the stillness outside. There was a mention of like activity indoors, like the Miss Pine is looking out the window, that kind of thing. Martha is walking in, so I'm going to leave this as a maybe. And D, to depict the setting as the characters await a visitor's arrival. Definitely nothing wrong with D. Okay, so not A, like we talked about. Not B, activity indoors with the stillness outside. There was no mention of stillness. And the whole point, the main purpose is not to contrast the activity indoors versus out. So actually we can delete C after giving it like a second consideration. And D, to depict the setting as the characters await a visitor's arrival. Definitely the answer. Okay. Next question is number 10. Astronomers are confident that the star will eventually consume all the helium in its core and explode in a supernova. They are much less confident, however, about when this will happen, since that depends on internal characteristics that are largely unknown. Astrophysicist Serafina and colleagues recently investigated whether acoustic waves in the star could be used to determine internal stellar states, but concluded that this method could not sufficiently reveal the internal characteristics to allow its evolutionary state to be firmly fixed. Okay, so let's write this down. They are much less confident about when this will happen. Less confident about when happen. Like that. Because characteristics inside, let's write unknown. Okay? Now keeping this in mind, which choice best describes the function of the second sentence in the overall structure of the text? A, it explains how the work of Nance and colleagues was received by others in the field. B, it presents the central finding reported. C, it identifies the problem that Nance and colleagues attempted to solve but did not. D, it describes a serious limitation. Okay, definitely not how the work was received, right? All they said was they're less confident about when it will happen because they're unsure about the internal characteristics. B, is this a finding, is what you should ask yourself. It presents the central finding reported by Nance. No, it was a statement about how they felt, less confident, not a finding, so we can delete B. C, it identifies the problem that Nance and colleagues attempted to solve but did not. Is there a problem? Sure, they're unsure about the inside, so yes, this is technically a problem. So I'm going to leave C as a maybe. D, it describes a serious limitation of the method. Was a method mentioned, is what you should ask yourself. And no, there's no method here. So that means now our maybe turns into a definite yes. Right? So this is one of those cases where we can actually delete 3 answer choices through elimination. And so there are going to be questions that you'll have 2 maybes, but this one it wasn't. I believe it's like a 50-50. I do see them quite often, both of those cases. But elimination is by far the easiest way to solve the SAT. Okay, now we're going to continue on with the questions for the remainder of the test in the next video.